Imagine a warship struck 6 times by suicide aircraft, hit by 4 heavy bombs, dead in the water, flooding on fire, with half her crew killed or wounded, and yet her guns never stopped firing. Imagine men standing on a deck tilted at impossible angles, ammunition cooking off beneath their feet, flames reaching toward the magazine that could turn the entire ship into a fireball, and still they fought. The USS Aaron Ward off Okinawa in May of 1945 became something more than metal and machinery. She became a testament to human defiance in the face of certain death. Before we dive into this incredible story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city, state, or country you are watching from. Stay with us until the very end, because what happened aboard this destroyer will challenge everything you think you know about survival. Now, let us go back to that terrible day. The sea was quiet that morning. Too quiet. Commander William Sanders stood on the bridge of the USS Aaron Ward and watched the horizon with the practiced eye of a naval officer who had learned not to trust calm water. It was May 3rd, 1945, and his ship was stationed at Radar Picket Station number 10, approximately 50 miles northwest of Okinawa. The position had earned a grim reputation among the fleet. Ships sent here rarely returned undamaged. Some did not return at all. The Aaron Ward was a destroyer mine layer, designated DM-34, and she carried a crew of 336 men. Most of them were young, far too young to have seen the things they had already witnessed in this war. They had been at sea for months, shuttling between the anchorage at Karamaretto and these exposed stations, watching the sky, waiting for the inevitable. The Japanese had found a new weapon, or perhaps an ancient one dressed in modern technology. They called it the Divine Wind. The Americans called it what it was, suicide. Sanders checked his watch. It was shortly after 6 in the evening. The light was beginning to soften, turning the water a deep metallic blue. In a few hours, darkness would offer some protection, but twilight was the worst time. The Kamikaze pilots preferred it. They could see their targets silhouetted against the fading sky while remaining difficult to track against the darkening horizon. The radar operators below decks had been staring at their scopes for hours, watching for the telltale blips that meant death was incoming. Below, in the cramped spaces of the ship, men tried to find moments of normalcy. Some wrote letters they knew might never be sent. Others cleaned weapons that were already spotless, a ritual that gave hands something to do when minds refused to settle. The galley crew prepared evening chow, though few men had much appetite these days. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the shriek of general quarters, or simply by dreams that replayed the attacks they had already survived. Steward First Class Carl Clark moved through the passageways with quiet efficiency. He was a black man in a segregated navy, assigned to serve officers their meals and maintain their quarters, work that did not reflect his intelligence or capability. He had learned to navigate the invisible boundaries of military racism with the same care he used to balance a tray of coffee cups in rough seas. But Clark had also trained himself in damage control, studying the ship's systems, learning how to fight fires and plug leaks, preparing for a moment he hoped would never come. He did not speak of this training to most people. He simply did the work and waited. On the bridge, Sanders received the first report at 1800 hours and 27 minutes. The radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom, professional but tight with tension. Bridge, Combat Information Center. Multiple bogies inbound, bearing 350, range 28 miles, speed 180 knots. Count approximately 24 aircraft. Sanders felt the familiar compression in his chest, the body's involuntary response to confirmed danger. He reached for the general alarm without hesitation. The klaxon ripped through the ship, a sound that made hearts race and adrenaline flood into exhausted bloodstreams. Men dropped what they were holding and ran to their battle stations, a choreographed chaos practiced so many times it had become instinct. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations. The crew of the Aaron Ward moved through the ship like blood through arteries, filling gun tubs, ammunition handling rooms, damage control lockers, and engineering spaces. Hatches slammed shut and were dog-tight, dividing the ship into watertight compartments. If the hull was breached, only one section would flood. In theory, men who had seen ships die knew the theory often failed in practice. Gunner's mate second-class Laverne Schroeder climbed into the Mount 53 gun tub on the starboard side, a 40mm BOFORS that could spit explosive shells at a rate that turned the sky into a wall of fire. His loader, a kid from Ohio who still looked like he should be in high school, fed the first clip into the weapon with hands that shook only slightly. They had done this before. They would do it again, for as long as they remained alive. The 5-inch guns swung toward the bearing reported by radar, their longer range giving the ship the first chance to kill the attackers before they closed to striking distance. Fire Controlman 3rd Class Bill McCanna watched the analog computer in the director, a mechanical brain that calculated deflection, range, and elevation, translating radar data into solutions that would place shells in the path of aircraft moving at 3 miles per minute. The first enemy planes appeared as dark specks against the sky, growing larger with terrifying speed. They were not flying in formation. They were not maneuvering evasively. They were simply coming straight in, committed to the dive that would end in explosion or death, often both. The Japanese pilots had been told they were divine instruments, that their sacrifice would drive the Americans from sacred soil, that their spirits would live forever in the honored halls of Yasukuni. Whether they believed this or simply saw no alternative to obedience, no one aboard the Aaron Ward could know. What mattered was that they were coming, and they would not turn away. Sanders gave the order to open fire, and the Aaron Ward transformed from a ship into a weapons platform. The 5-inch guns spoke first, their reports sharp and violent, shaking the deck beneath the crew's feet. Shells traced upward, detonating in black flowers of shrapnel designed to shred aluminum and flesh. The first Kamikaze caught fire and tumbled into the sea 1,000 yards out, trailing smoke and burning fuel. No one cheered. There were too many others. The 40mm mounts opened up next, their faster rate of fire creating overlapping fields of death. Tracers laced the sky, every 5th round burning bright so gunners could walk their fire onto target. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that made thought impossible and reduced the world to pure sensation. Men shouted to each other and could not hear their own voices. The smell of cordite and hot metal filled the air, acrid and choking. A second Kamikaze disintegrated under concentrated fire from Mount 52, pieces of aircraft spinning away in different directions, the engine block plunging into the water like a dropped stone. A third began its dive, angling toward the bridge. Every gun that could bear swung toward it, pouring fire into its path. The plane shuddered as shells tore through its wings and fuselage, but momentum carried it forward. At the last moment, it veered, clipping the foremast and cartwheeling into the sea off the port side, close enough that the splash drenched the forward gun crews. Sanders barely had time to register the near miss before Combat Information Center reported more aircraft inbound from a different bearing. The Japanese were coordinating their attack, coming from multiple directions to divide the ship's defensive fire. It was a tactic that had sunk other vessels, and Sanders knew his ship was now fighting for survival measured in minutes. A bomber, a twin-engine aircraft that looked like a Mitsubishi Betty, broke through the defensive fire at an altitude higher than the Kamikaze fighters. The gunners tracked it, firing, hitting it but not stopping it. The plane opened its bomb bay, and a single weapon fell away, tumbling through the air with terrible deliberation. Men on deck watched it fall, unable to do anything but brace for impact. The bomb struck the Aaron Ward at the waterline near the after-engine room, penetrating the hull before detonating. The explosion was catastrophic. It ripped through the engine room, killing or maiming every man inside instantly. Superheated steam and fragmented metal tore through bulkheads. The lights throughout the after part of the ship went dark as electrical cables were severed. The engine room flooded within seconds, and with it went the ship's propulsion. The Aaron Ward lost speed, wallowing in the water, no longer able to maneuver. She became what every warship feared, a stationary target. Fire erupted from the wound, feeding on fuel oil and hydraulic fluid. Smoke poured from ruptured vents, thick and black, reducing visibility to almost nothing. In the forward engine room, men felt the shock wave through the deck and knew their shipmates in the after spaces were gone. They kept their own equipment running, maintaining power to the guns for as long as physics would allow. Commander Sanders felt the ship lose way beneath him, the vibration of the engines dying to silence. His steering was gone. His ability to dodge was gone. He could only continue to fight with the weapons that still functioned and hope that would be enough. He ordered damage control teams to the after spaces, knowing even as he spoke that there was likely no one left alive to save. A Kamikaze, a Mitsubishi Zero fighter, selected the Aaron Ward from among the ships in the formation and committed to its dive. The pilot had probably been told to aim for the bridge, to kill the officers and decapitate the command structure. The plane came in low and fast, skimming the wavetops to avoid radar detection until the final approach, then pulling up into a steep climb before rolling over into the terminal dive. Gunners tracked it, firing, the tracers converging on the aircraft like luminous threads being woven together. Shells struck the engine, the wings, the cockpit. Pieces of the plane flew off, but still it came. At the last moment, it jinked slightly to avoid a mast, and instead of striking the bridge, it slammed into the superstructure just aft of the pilot house. The impact was shattering. The Zero's engine, a heavy radial weighing over 1,000 pounds, punched through steel plating like it was paper. Aviation fuel ignited on contact, spraying burning gasoline across the deck and into interior spaces. The explosion killed men instantly. Others were engulfed in flames, staggering and screaming before collapsing. The fire spread with horrifying speed, consuming everything combustible. Shrapnel from the blast tore through the pilot house, wounding several men. Sanders remained standing, bleeding from a gash on his arm, shouting orders that could barely be heard over the roar of fire and the continuing thunder of defensive guns. The ship was dying section by section, but the guns had not stopped firing. Another kamikaze came in from the starboard quarter, targeted by Mount 53. Schroeder and his loader poured fire into it, walking their shells up from the tail to the cockpit. The plane began to burn, but the pilot held his course with fanatical determination. The Zero struck the base of the mount, the impact crushing metal and flesh together. The explosion silenced the gun. Schroeder was thrown clear, his body broken. His loader was not thrown anywhere. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of him large enough to identify. The ship was now burning in multiple locations, dead in the water, with fires spreading toward the forward magazine, where hundreds of rounds of ammunition were stored. If that magazine cooked off, the Aaron Ward would cease to exist. She would simply come apart in a fireball visible for miles. In the chaos, Carl Clark moved through spaces filled with smoke and flame, leading a damage control party that was desperately trying to contain fires that seemed to multiply faster than they could be extinguished. Clark had studied the ship's layout, and he knew exactly where the greatest danger lay. The ammunition handling room below Mount 51 was directly above the forward magazine, and it was already on fire. The heat in that space was beyond human tolerance. The air itself seemed to burn. Ammunition rounds stacked in the handling room were beginning to cook, their casings expanding, the propellant inside heating toward the temperature at which it would ignite. When that happened, the resulting explosion would set off a chain reaction that would detonate the magazine below, and the Aaron Ward would join the growing list of ships that simply vanished in a single catastrophic blast. Clark and his team dragged fire hoses through passageways choked with smoke, the heat so intense it blistered exposed skin. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and had to be dragged back. Others took their places. The fire hoses pumped seawater, but the water pressure was dropping as damage to the ship's systems reduced the efficiency of the pumps. What came out of the nozzles was barely enough to wet down the flames, let alone extinguish them. Clark could hear the ammunition cooking, a sound like popcorn at first, then louder, sharper cracks as larger rounds began to detonate. He knew they had minutes at most. He made a decision that should have killed him. He ordered his men to fall back, then he went forward alone into the ammunition handling room. The heat was unsurvivable. Clark could feel his skin burning. His lungs screamed for air that was not superheated steam. He could not see through the smoke, navigating by memory and touch. The rounds were stacked in racks and they were glowing red. Some had already begun to rupture, spilling burning propellant onto the deck. Clark aimed the fire hose at the base of the racks, trying to cool the metal, trying to buy seconds, trying to prevent the one round from cooking off that would start the cascade. He held the hose with strength born of desperation, water streaming over ammunition that was seconds from detonation. The heat was cooking the water into steam before it even touched the rounds. Clark's hands were burning where they gripped the hose. He could not breathe. He could not see. He simply held on, pouring water into hell, refusing to let the ship die. Above him, on deck, the attack continued. Another kamikaze struck the port side, tearing through the hull below the waterline. Water rushed in, flooding compartments that were supposed to be sealed but had been damaged by previous hits. The Aaron Ward began to list, tilting to port as thousands of tons of seawater filled her interior spaces. Men working guns on the port side found themselves standing at steep angles, bracing against rails to keep from sliding across the deck. A bomber made another pass, releasing a bomb that struck near the forward stack, the explosion rupturing steam lines and filling the air with scalding vapor. Men caught in the steam died instantly, their skin cooked off their bodies. Others, partially exposed, suffered burns that would kill them slowly, painfully, over the hours and days to come. The medical spaces were overwhelmed. Pharmacists' mates worked in near darkness, the emergency lighting barely enough to see by, trying to triage men who were bleeding out, burned beyond recognition, or torn apart by shrapnel. There were not enough morphine syrettes. There were not enough bandages. There were not enough hands. Men died waiting for treatment that never came, and the medics moved on to the next casualty, and the next, knowing they were losing more than they saved. On the bridge, Sanders assessed the damage with a clarity born of training and necessity. His ship was burning, flooding, listing, and dead in the water. He had lost count of how many kamikazes had struck. He had lost track of how many of his crew were dead. What he knew was that the guns were still firing, and as long as they were firing, the ship was still fighting. A fourth kamikaze dove toward the bow, targeted by the remaining forward guns. The 20mm mounts chattered, their lighter rounds less effective at range but devastating at close distance. The plane took hits along its entire length, the fuselage disintegrating, but again momentum carried the wreckage forward. It crashed into the forecastle, the impact tearing through the deck and rupturing the hull. More flooding. More fire. The bow began to settle deeper into the water. Sanders knew they could not survive many more hits. The ship was approaching the limits of buoyancy. She was taking on water faster than the pumps could discharge it, and many of the pumps were no longer functioning. He considered giving the order to abandon ship, but even as the thought formed, he dismissed it. There were wounded men trapped below decks who could not be moved. There were fires that, if left uncontained, would consume the ship. And most critically, there were still enemy aircraft in the sky, and as long as his guns could fire, he would deny the enemy easy kills against other vessels in the formation. Below in the ammunition handling room, Carl Clark finally felt the temperature begin to drop. The water, combined with the flooding that had partially submerged the lower levels of the compartment, was cooling the rounds enough to prevent detonation. He had won his private battle against physics and fire, but the cost was written on his body. His hands were burned to the point where he could no longer feel them. His face was blistered. His lungs had been seared by superheated air. He staggered backward, collapsing in the passageway, where his damage control team found him and dragged him toward the medical spaces. The attack, which had felt like it lasted hours, had in reality consumed less than 30 minutes. But in that half hour, the Aaron Ward had been struck by 6 kamikaze aircraft and hit by 4 heavy bombs. 45 men were dead or dying. 49 were wounded, many critically. The ship was a floating wreck, her deck a landscape of twisted metal and fire, her hull compromised in multiple locations, her machinery spaces flooded or destroyed. And yet, impossibly, she was still afloat. The remaining gun crews continued to fire at targets that were now breaking off, the attack wave exhausted. The Japanese had thrown 25 aircraft at the ships on radar Picket Station number 10. Most had been shot down, either by the Aaron Ward or by accompanying vessels. But the few that got through had done catastrophic damage. As the last enemy aircraft disappeared from radar, an exhausted silence settled over the ship, broken only by the crackle of fires and the groans of wounded men. Sanders surveyed his command from the bridge and felt the weight of command settle on him like a physical burden. He had kept his ship fighting. Now he had to keep her afloat. The damage control parties worked through the night, shoring up bulkheads, pumping compartments, fighting fires that refused to die. The list to port increased to 17 degrees, then stabilized as counterflooding balanced the weight of water. The ship sat low in the water, her freeboard reduced to the point where waves washed over the main deck. In a heavy sea, she would have foundered. The calm weather that had seemed ominous that morning now became the margin of survival. The USS Shannon, a destroyer that had been operating nearby, approached carefully through the darkness. The seas around Okinawa were mined, and navigating at night carried its own deadly risks. But the Shannon's captain understood that the Aaron Ward could not remain where she was. Dead in the water, she was a target for submarines, for follow-up air attacks, for any enemy that wanted an easy kill. The Shannon came alongside, close enough to pass lines, and began the delicate process of taking the damaged ship under tow. In darkness, with a vessel that was barely afloat, listing and threatening to capsize with any sudden movement, the evolution was terrifyingly dangerous. Sailors on both ships worked with a precision born of desperation, securing tow cables, rigging emergency steering, preparing for the slow journey back to Kamikazes. The tow began shortly after midnight. The Shannon pulled ahead, taking up slack slowly, feeling for the point where tension would hold the Aaron Ward steady without capsizing her. The damaged ship wallowed in the swell, her movements sluggish and unpredictable. Men stationed on her deck watched the water with the intensity of those who knew they were one bad wave away from sinking. The journey to Kamikazes covered approximately 50 miles and took the entire night. Every mile was a negotiation with physics and chance. The tow cable thrummed with tension, singing in the wind. The Aaron Ward settled deeper, her pumps fighting a losing battle against the water still pouring in through damaged hull plates. Sanders remained on the bridge, refusing to leave his post, watching the ship respond to every swell, every shift in the tow cable's angle. Dawn found them approaching the anchorage, the Aaron Ward still afloat, still burning in places, still refusing to sink. As they entered the protected waters, other ships sounded their horns in salute, a recognition of survival against odds that should have been insurmountable. The men aboard the Aaron Ward were too exhausted to acknowledge the gesture. They simply held on, waiting for the moment when they could finally step off the ship that had become their tomb and their salvation. The final casualty count was 45 dead and 49 wounded out of a crew of 336. More than a quarter of the crew had been killed or injured. The ship herself was damaged beyond economical repair. The Navy would eventually decide that the cost of rebuilding her exceeded the value of the vessel. She would be decommissioned, her useful life ended by 30 minutes of concentrated violence. Commander Sanders wrote his after-action report with the careful precision of a man documenting events that seemed impossible even to those who had lived through them. He detailed the sequence of attacks, the damage sustained, the heroism displayed. He specifically noted the actions of Steward First Class Carl Clark, whose solitary stand in the ammunition handling room had prevented the magazine explosion that would have killed everyone aboard. Sanders recommended Clark for the Navy Cross, the service's second-highest decoration for valor. The recommendation was forwarded up the chain of command, reviewed by officers who had not been there, who had not felt the heat or heard the ammunition cooking, who made their decisions based on factors that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the color of a man's skin. The recommendation was downgraded, then downgraded again. Carl Clark received a Bronze Star, a commendation for meritorious service, the kind of medal given for administrative achievement or competent performance of assigned duties. The citation mentioned his actions in fighting fires but did not capture the reality of what he had done, the impossible heat he had endured, the seconds he had stolen from certain death. Clark accepted the medal without complaint. He had not performed his actions for recognition. He had done what needed to be done because he was a sailor aboard a dying ship, and sailors fight to save their ships. That the Navy did not see fit to acknowledge the full measure of his courage was disappointing but not surprising. He had lived his entire life navigating the boundaries of institutional racism. One more instance of being overlooked was simply confirmation of what he already knew. The years passed. The Aaron Ward was sold for scrap, her metal recycled, her name struck from the Naval Register. The men who had served aboard her scattered to civilian life, carrying memories they could not fully articulate to people who had not been there. They gathered at reunions, fewer each year, and remembered shipmates who had not made it home. They told stories that became polished with repetition, but the core truth remained raw and undiminished. Carl Clark returned to civilian life and worked quietly, raising a family, never speaking much about the war. When people asked if he had seen combat, he would nod and change the subject. The medal sat in a drawer, taken out occasionally, looked at, put away again. He did not display it. He did not speak of what it represented or what it should have represented. Decades passed. Researchers studying the battle off Okinawa began to piece together the full story of Radar Picket Station No. 10. They interviewed survivors, cross-referenced action reports, examined damage assessments. The story of the Aaron Ward emerged as one of the most remarkable survival stories of the Pacific War. And in that story, Carl Clark's actions stood out as extraordinary even among a crew that had performed with exceptional courage. Historians began to ask questions. Why had Clark received only a Bronze Star for actions that clearly warranted higher recognition? The answer, when it came, was uncomfortable but undeniable. Institutional racism had denied him the recognition he deserved. The Navy had failed one of its own heroes, not because his actions were insufficient, but because his skin was the wrong color. In 2012, 67 years after the battle, the Navy finally corrected the injustice. Carl Clark was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the recognition Commander Sanders had recommended in 1945. The ceremony was attended by Clark's family, by surviving crew members of the Aaron Ward, by Navy officials who acknowledged the mistake and the systemic prejudice that had caused it. The medal was presented to Clark's daughter, who accepted it with quiet dignity, much as her father would have done. She spoke briefly, thanking those who had worked to achieve this recognition, noting that her father had never sought glory but had simply done his duty. She said he would have been pleased but not surprised that it took so long. He had understood the world he lived in, even as he refused to let it define the limits of his courage. The story of the USS Aaron Ward and Carl Clark stands as testimony to several truths. It speaks to the extraordinary resilience of men pushed beyond normal human limits. It demonstrates that ships are more than steel and machinery. They are the collective will of their crews made manifest. It reveals the courage that exists in ordinary people when circumstances demand the extraordinary. And it reminds us that heroism does not always receive immediate recognition, that justice can be delayed by prejudice. But that truth eventually emerges, even if those who lived it are no longer present to receive their due. The Aaron Ward fought for 30 minutes against overwhelming odds and refused to sink. Her crew kept guns firing when the ship was dead in the water, flooding, burning, and falling apart beneath their feet. They saved their ship through determination and sacrifice, and in doing so, they wrote a chapter of naval history that deserves to be remembered. Carl Clark stood alone in an ammunition-handling room hot enough to melt steel, holding a fire hose with burned hands, fighting to prevent an explosion that would have killed everyone aboard. He won that fight, and in winning it, he saved the ship and her crew. That he was not immediately honored as he should have been is a stain on the institution he served. That he was eventually recognized is a small measure of redemption. The guns of the Aaron Ward fell silent on May 3, 1945, only when there were no more targets to engage. Until that moment, damaged and dying, the ship continued to fight. That is the measure of her crew. That is the legacy they left behind. We want to hear from you. What part of this story impacted you the most? Was it the relentless kamikaze attacks, Carl Clark's lonely fight in the ammunition handling room, or the delayed recognition of his heroism? Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you found this story meaningful, and leave a like if you believe these stories deserve to be told. Most importantly, write in the comments which city, state, or country you are watching from. These voices from the past speak across decades, and your engagement helps ensure they continue to be heard. Thank you for bearing witness to the story of the USS Aaron Ward and the men who refused to let her die.